Welcome back to Recommended Daily Value. Today we are going to talk about training volume, which is a topic very near and dear to my heart and something I have thought about way too much. More specifically, we're going to talk about how much volume do you need to gain muscle, how much volume do you need to maximize muscle growth, and how much volume do you need to not lose muscle, which are three very interesting questions with very different answers. But first, let's define a couple of terms. So what is volume? So traditionally, back in the day, as they say, volume was defined as total load lifted, usually per muscle group in a session or in a week. So that would be the weight you're using, the amount of sets you did, and the reps you hit in each set. So for example, if I lift a 10-pound dumbbell and I do 10 reps of curls for 3 sets, that would be 10 reps for 10 pounds, 100, and 3 sets. That'll be 300 total pounds lifted for my biceps across a workout. Today, most people use total sets performed for a muscle group, usually within a certain proximity to failure. So 3 to 5 reps, the quote unquote effective reps. So not junk volume, which I think is kind of a bogus term anyway, but not warm-up sets and things like that. And then in some of the better, more up-to-date models, now those are inherently better, they will use partial sets as well. So for every lat exercise you do, like a row or a pull-up, that will count as a half set in your total volume for biceps. And this is where we can kind of start to answer these questions. So I will give you my takeaways, TLDR. I don't want to listen to the rest of this. Just give me the answer. And then I'll give you some justification as to why I think these things. With how much muscle, how much volume, how many sets do I need? I'm going to use the sets definition. So how many sets do I need to not lose muscle mass? And that is probably about 1 set per week, taking 2 or very close to failure per muscle group. I would personally lean on the safer side and not use the partial sets idea. So your lats are your lats. I wouldn't necessarily count that for biceps. That's me. I'm on the safer side. If you wanted to do that, you could probably get away with 5 or 6 compound lifts, squat, bench, maybe a pull-up, and some kind of calf raise, and maybe some kind of pulling exercise like a hamstring RDL or something like that, and maybe throw in like a middle delt raise. You would probably be about 90% of the way there. May as well do a second set though, because you probably have 45 minutes if you have 30 minutes to lift, and that'll make sure you're in a pretty good safe spot to minimize muscle loss during a busy phase of life. If you are in a cut, which a fat loss phase, I would recommend keeping volume a little bit higher, at least doing twice a week, partially just for the frequency of, hey, I want to hit the muscle mass more often to give that stimulus more frequently to hopefully sway my body and my brain. And like, hey, we're actually kind of using this stuff somewhat consistently. This would be useful to hold on to. So how much muscle do you need to gain muscle? How much volume do you need to gain muscle? So the second question here is probably somewhere along the lines of 2 hard sets per muscle group for most people. Now, this will range depending on the person. If you are very untrained, you can basically sneeze and gain muscle, or just look at a dumbbell and gain muscle. The more advanced you get, the closer this is going to get to the 2 hard sets per muscle group. And I would, again, probably not count, if I had to guess, this is me projecting here, the partial sets per muscle group. So like the biceps counting towards a row or vice versa. I think that is useful. And that is probably about where most people should be. And if you want, if you want to specialize, you could probably hit those twice a week if you really want to get the most bang for your buck in terms of muscle growth. Now, where is the end of the line for maximizing muscle growth, getting as much muscle growth as possible? And I think there's one paper that cites about 10 sets per muscle group per week is the line where you maximize all muscle growth. Now, we're talking about training volume. There is a debate between high intensity and low volume and high volume trainers. Here is where I think a lot of the issues lie with some of the research with higher volume training and some of the drawbacks towards the high intensity side, as I see it as well, at least, theoretically. So with the high volume group, so you basically have these two ideas, right? So you have volume and intensity. Intensity can either be viewed as, and is typically most likely viewed as, proximity to your 1 rep max in terms of load used. So how heavy is the weight you're using compared to the maximum amount you could move for 1 repetition. It is also more colloquially referred to as proximity to failure. So how many more reps did you have in the tank that you could have achieved? And a proxy for that is often used as like bar path or bar speed. So how slow those last few reps are getting. Sometimes people will use that to standardize these things. The issue is that as you add more and more volume, your proximity to failure and your intensity as far as the load lifted tends to decrease, and you tend to stop making as much progress. And I think this is, by definition, kind of what happens when you start adding more and more volume. There's going to become a point where your body cannot sustain X amount of volume for a prolonged period of time. For example, if I just were to double your workout or my workout tomorrow, I might be fine for a few weeks, but after said point, my body just starts to get beat up. I'm no longer really enjoying my workouts. I'm not pushing myself as hard, and I kind of just plateau. And at said point, I would be better off having less sets, taking those closer to failure, keeping the intensity, the weight lifted, as high as possible. And I think that is always the case. So my case for high volume versus high intensity workouts is that you want to do as high of a volume as you can without sacrificing intensity. And I think this makes the most sense. The absolute argument that high intensity is better is something along the lines of there's this magical, and that makes it sound, I'm exaggerating this a little bit, but there is a point where you stimulate and turn on enough of the high threshold motor units. So you hit a threshold within a set, you get close enough to failure that basically the entire muscle group is activated, more or less, say 80%. Let's just throw out a random number. And that is all you need to do to stimulate and maximize the stimulus of muscle growth. So, for example, you curl and your 1 rep max or your 10 rep max is 10 reps at 80 pounds or whatever, 80 pounds, and you do 9 reps or 8 reps or 7 reps, whatever this magical number is, that stimulated or turned on enough of your high threshold motor units. Your high threshold motor units are the ones that are able to lift heavy loads, versus your lower threshold, fine threshold motor units are the ones that help you scratch your head and all those things. They're turned on more frequently, all the time actually, whereas your high threshold motor units are like the last things to turn on when you're approaching failure. That you turn those on, you activate those, and that's it. That is the maximum amount of muscle growth that you can stimulate. And everything thereafter is junk volume for the most part. Actually, well, according to some of these, everything thereafter is junk volume because you're no longer creating any greater stimulus of muscle growth, which means that every set thereafter was basically a waste of time and possibly being a detriment as far as fatigue, time spent in the gym that is wasted because it's not getting you more muscle growth, possibly taking away the stimulus you could get from other muscle groups because you did 5 sets of biceps when you could have maximized your growth at 1, and therefore you would have had a lot more energy to train your tibs, because I know all of you want to be training your tibs and have some nice juicy tibialis muscles. Highly underrated, by the way. So I don't necessarily buy that. And the reason I don't buy that, and I'm open to being wrong here, is because if you look at every other domain in the world, the more volume that you do, the better results you get. And that is in chess, that is in learning a language, that is in any sport ever. The more you can get quality repetitions, the more frequently you can have quality sessions, like workouts equivalent, the more reps you can get or sets, it's the faster you will progress, assuming you can recover from them and also not get injured, which doesn't happen as often in chess. Sometimes I guess they do sprain their fingers and they're out for a few weeks, but a little bit more common in the weight room or in sports. And so, or even like guitars is another example. Like the more you play, the better you get, not linearly, but generally. It's an hours game, it's a time game. And that is why I don't necessarily buy that argument in terms of muscle growth. I don't think that, I think that if you can, instead of, there's a maximum threshold that like 85%, you get 85% of your muscle turned on, and that maximizes it. I think you're personally going to see 95% you get a smaller, but better or greater muscle growth stimulus, a little bit more muscle growth, 95%, 96%, 97%. The question then becomes, okay, how can I increase my volume if I want to? And practically, what are some of the limitations to this? Because I think there are practically a lot of limitations to this. And I just did a really high volume split, and I'm currently doing a much lower volume split. And I will tell you some of the limitations that I personally experienced. So the first one is, again, I'm going to repeat this definition. I think you should add as much volume as you can without sacrificing any of the other variables, which is proximity to failure, so training either to failure or very close to failure consistently, like the same amount of reps away. If I add another set, so I'll go from 2 to 3 sets, but now all 3 of my sets are 2 reps further away from failure, I'm probably getting the same amount of muscle growth stimulus. It's just taking me more time. And again, also taking away from this whole systemic pool of what I can put into the gym, both in terms of like my time I want to spend there and energy that I have to put into each individual muscle group, right? Because we know in general, and I think there's a good amount of research to back this up, I could be wrong, the first muscle you hit in a workout is going to receive the greatest stimulus, and every muscle thereafter going to receive less and less of stimulus. Now, I don't think this is true in total, because if you half-ass all your workouts and then just wait till biceps at the end, that'll be fine. But assuming everything, all else is equal, I think ceteris paribus or whatever, the last muscle you do is going to receive the least muscle growth stimulus. And again, people over and over again will add a lot of volume, but they take away intensity. They're lifting less, or they're not going as close to failure. And that is something that I experienced in my last mesocycle. Specifically, like you think you're going to failure, but you just don't really have it in you, because one, maybe you're bored, maybe you're just exhausted. I'm doing all these supersets to save time because I don't have all day to spend in the gym, and I don't really want to spend all day in the gym, but I was willing to push myself as hard as I could in that time I was willing to spend in the gym to do as much muscle or to do as much volume as possible to what I thought maximized the stimulus. The issue I ran into here is I was clearly not pushing myself to failure. And I think there's this idea of rate of perceived exertion, which Steve Magnus, who's a runner, he had a podcast on this recently, and it was really interesting hearing him talk about it. And rate of perceived exertion is relative. So if someone throws a penny on the ground and tells me I need to sprint after it barefoot, this is the exact example they use, so I'm stealing this from them, I probably am not going to sprint too hard or for very long because I'm barefoot and I don't really care about a penny. If my theoretical daughter is getting mauled by a bear at the end of the block, I'm going to sprint straight through that bear. Doesn't matter the amount of pain that I'm in. I'm probably not even going to feel that tired or in that much pain because I have a huge amount of motivation to get there, whereas the penny, not a huge amount of motivation. I think that this is a huge practical limitation of the studies on higher volume training. If you have a trainer or maybe a training partner that can standardize all of the things we've discussed over and over again now, the proximity to failure and the intensity that you're using, then it is a lot easier for you to continue to make progress. But for those of us who are, sometimes schlepping ourselves to the gym, or, when you're working out 5 days a week for an hour each day, a lot of days feel like you're schlepping yourself to the gym. I think you stop. A lot of people will struggle to push themselves as hard as if they had limited their volume, reduced the number of training sessions, and kept the quality as high as possible. And that's essentially what I keep saying, right? Like we want to keep what is the maximum amount of volume you can take, you can withstand without the quality of your training beginning to suffer. Because I think a lot of people, I've probably said this 3 times already, and it's worth repeating again, people will continue to push the training volume, but their training quality continues to suffer. And these are clearly at odds with each other in terms of this muscle growth maximizing stimulus that we're trying to get. So if you're in a lab and they can standardize how close to failure you are, your load, and they can really push you and say, okay, you have another rep in there, you still have another rep, but you didn't get close enough to failure here. We're going to add another set as a result of that or something along those lines. Then maybe this becomes more viable. Another thing is if you have all day to spend in the gym. A lot of times as we add more volume, we sacrifice rest. And I think that is okay in certain circumstances, but that is exactly the point. Like theoretically, if you're getting a little bit more muscle growth stimulus by going to failure rather than leaving 3 reps in reserve, so you now add a second set of 3 reps in reserve, would you have gotten more, if not just as much stimulus as doing 1 set to absolute failure? Probably, which is why I think we need to be standardizing these things and why the studies may not be as practical as we think. Again, RPE, so the motivation there. Fatigue, these studies aren't very long. So this applies, in my opinion, in a number of ways. One being novelty. It's really easy when you have new workouts. New workouts don't need to mean today or tomorrow or next week, but a few months, few weeks. It's easy to keep pushing yourselves, and you have the pretty steep cognitive learning period where it's motivating because you are building skill pretty rapidly and you're getting stronger. But this doesn't last. And so I think that what can seem like you're making progress with a higher volume in the short term will likely plateau. Now, there's a good caveat here that I think strength and hypertrophy strength is masked by hypertrophy because strength is largely neurological. The skill, half of it is, the engine that you have, how much muscle mass you have. And the more muscle mass you try and build, the more fatigue you're going to accumulate, which is going to reduce your potential for neurological output. Therefore, you're not going to seem as strong. This is why you see weightlifters taper down or even runners taper down to allow themselves to perform better at the meet using things like overtraining, like intentional overtraining. I forget what the actual word that they use to describe that, but they'll kind of peak, recover, and then hopefully get even better after they have fully recovered and adapted. But that is a kind of a fine line. The issue there is that I think that as fatigue masks strength and thereby performance, that doesn't mean that long term you shouldn't be spending more time in a muscle growth phase. Meaning that I think long term, the more muscle that you grow, the stronger you will get. But in the short term, the hypertrophy, the higher volume, more stimulating, more fatiguing efforts will make you seem weaker. But this is where it gets tough. It's a little bit of a gray area because, okay, well, we should be making, like, you should always be progressing in the gym, even if it's at a slow rate. But if you are getting to the point where you're making no progress, not adding any reps, not adding any weight to the bar over a period of 4 to 6 weeks, you are probably doing something wrong. You're not recovering, very possibly. Maybe it's just you've had a couple of weeks of too much stress. Maybe your nutrition's off, but very likely you're just doing too much to recover from. And that might be, if we talk about like an overtraining idea, or not overtraining, but like where they peak and they intentionally overtrain and then they recover and then they actually super adapt. You need to look at what is this called? Overtraining Olympic athletes strategy. Let's see if I can have 1,500 typos. It is called periodization. No, that is not what it's called. But it is basically an intentional period of overtraining that they use to peak and hopefully hit even new highs at this, like at the competition. So point being is like, okay, so you might take a few weeks off and now you're feeling stress or much better, or you're recovering a lot better. You're actually able to move the load and you start making progress again. That is also a possibility here. And the issue with a lot of these studies is it's not an issue with the studies. It's the issue when you try to apply these studies is that muscle growth is so slow, especially after the newbie and even intermediate phases, that it's almost impossible to run experiments on yourself. Because, if it's linear, let's assume muscle growth is linear because you're able to have a consistent input of efforts and all those things. The only way you would really see this either peak and go up in a non-linear fashion or decline if you get injured and you stop lifting, which is kind of besides the point. But if you were doing something so wrong that you were hindering your muscle growth, and I really don't think there's any kind of magic sauce other than creatine. I'm just joking. Creatine literally does almost nothing in the grand scheme. Adds a few percentage points. It's not going to go like this to your graph. It's going to be like, did you even see that move? Probably didn't even move. And that's the point. Like all these things, extra, like Eric Helms is like the idea of his pyramid where adherence is at the bottom, exercise selection is like this little tiny thing at the top. Almost all of the inputs that you're hopefully doing already don't matter. Like adding another set is going to be such a tiny amount more of muscle mass increase. You can only be messing yourself up by not getting enough protein, maybe not getting enough quality protein, maybe not getting enough sleep so that your performance is suffering outside of how much training volume that you're doing. And that's the issue. So it's really hard, in my opinion, to be like, oh, unless you were doing like way too much volume or way too little volume and taking yourself way too far away from failure, you're probably not going to see this big jump in muscle growth. It's just a reality unless you were really messing up before, which is less indicative of something being magical and more of your current whatever you were doing sucking, respectfully. Okay, and then lastly, just a time commitment thing. I just don't know how much, if adherence at the bottom of Eric Helms' pyramid, right, of what matters for muscle growth, the number one thing is adherence. And I am a very experienced lifter. I have listened, when I go to the gym, like I can listen to Louis Capaldi, where people would be crying their eyes out. I've listened to podcasts, although I do not love that. It doesn't really matter what I'm listening to because typically once I start the set, I don't hear anything anyway. It's just to get me into the set. Okay, the only thing on leg day, I will put on some more intense music if I am listening to music. Sometimes I don't even listen to music. Point being, I don't need a lot of motivation to get there. These workouts, these high volume workouts were grueling, dude. Even from day one, I was like, this stinks. Like it's just nonstop, no rest. I don't really get to push myself, or like I'm trying to push myself, but doesn't feel like you have the capacity to put it all on the table, which is what Jeff Nippard said in his most recent video where he's talking about this lower volume, higher intensity training. And I'll keep rehashing it. I just think so many people are, including myself, are missing the 8 ball here because they just are adding sets. And for me, if you're a knucklehead, which I am for sure, you just, you don't say, okay, I'm going to add sets for my biceps. You add sets uniformly across the program, which is idiotic because now you have added a third, 33% more volume to your workout, and you just assume that, hey, I'm going to be able to recover from all this and train just as hard week over week. You might be able to for a few weeks, but that gas tank's going to deplete, and then you're going to be exhausted, and then you have to take a few weeks off or really lower volume to like below your maximal capacity for volume and your maximal recoverable volumes, like the RP guys will say. And I think that's kind of just like, you go in a big bulk and you gain some muscle but a lot of fat, and then you spend way more time than you should have needed to cutting in a fat loss phase. You lose a little bit of muscle there, and then you bulk again. You do it aggressively, and this is literally me talking about myself. And you could have had a much more linear muscle growth journey where like maybe you cut here and there, but really just like kind of milking out a lot of muscle growth, maximizing it as much as possible, spending as least time in a calorie deficit as possible. Instead, you just kind of like went like this, and yes, the trend line is still going up, but it could have been a little bit more linear if you just had been more patient and didn't eat 40 Chipwiches a night or 4 ice cream sandwiches in dirty bulk, even though I would have never told you I was dirty bulking. you can definitely not gain 2 pounds of muscle per month as a natural lifter, maybe after your first like 6 months of lifting. And even then, you probably don't even need to worry about gaining that much weight because you probably can just exchange fat for muscle like at the exchange store because it's that easy. All right. And so here is some other concepts that I think are worth thinking about. So again, if you are trying to push muscle growth for a specific body part, for me, it's constantly the biceps and the arms. I think it is worth considering, and this is a concept I'll hopefully be diving into more, taking Pat Davidson's hybrid athlete workshop. I missed the first seminar, sadly. I completely forgot about it. They didn't send an email to the day of, so it's kind of on me. But I'm really excited for it. It seems like it's going to be dope. He talks a lot about maintenance volume and getting a threshold of strength for all of these muscle groups that you want to train. So, for example, for runners, having strong enough legs such that it significantly reduces the likelihood of injury. I think this is just a more theoretical idea. I don't know if there's actual practical takeaways as far as how much muscle or strength you need to have, but it does make sense in my eyes that if we look at particularly force outputs and isolate that alone, if you can handle X amount of force more than is demanded in the sport across that muscle group, you will likely have a more robust nature and be more resilient to injury. But so you might look at that like, okay, I'm going to try to build up my biceps and my legs are on maintenance volume and my entire lower body, I'm just focusing on my chest and my arms, and I'm going to push that volume and everything else can be kind of on a maintenance volume. Now, I think maintenance volume probably doesn't even exist, probably shouldn't really be looked at as what you should be doing, maybe for a short-term stint where you're really busy or something like that, like you just want to not minimize muscle loss. Great, that's probably what maintenance volume is for. Otherwise, you should be trying to like slowly get more results over time. And the way I would approach like maximizing this is like doing 2 days a week of that muscle group. So for me right now, it's arms, and also prioritizing that earlier in the workout. Same thing if you want to prioritize chest or delts. But this is in the hybrid athlete world, like you might just say, okay, my legs are big enough, but I'm going to prioritize some speed work for them. And so I'll do a little bit of hypertrophy / strength work. All hypertrophy is kind of strength work. And I'm going to kind of just do as little as I need to not get weaker, and maybe continuing to slowly make progress every few weeks. I'm still seeing a few reps, adding a few reps to the bar. And you can kind of mix and match these things where it's like, okay, I'm actually trying to get my chest and my bench as strong as possible, but I'm trying to build my arms as much as possible. And these are interesting things that I think you can play with because strength is typically used in a much lower rep range and much further away from failure, which means it's not as fatiguing systemically or locally. So you can do and you don't need as many sets, like much steeper drop off for growth as far as like strength gains with strength. So I could do like a low volume, high intensity, not that close to failure for my chest, high volume, higher volume for my arms, and the same thing for my calves. Want to build those, and quads and hamstrings. Going to do as little as I need to, but I'm going to sprint and do those things. And you start periodizing these phases. Okay, you know what? It's winter, it's snowboarding season. I'm not going to be sprinting outside or running that much. Let's build some meat in my legs, and everything else we're going to kind of periodize into like, all right, we're going to maintain the volume here, try to make slow progress, but not our focus, and shifting the focus over time. And I think this is kind of a really fun way to both make progress because strength gains happen a lot faster, especially if you're changing up exercises somewhat consistently, which is kind of an illusion that you're getting stronger, but also kind of a fun game to play. And I think when you've been trying to put on muscle, I think trying to put on muscle in general is a really hard goal as after 10 years. And it, like for me, people that are like very disciplined into it, you can continue to do it. But even me, I'm like kind of burnt out after that high volume, I don't know, however many months, 3 or 4 month phase. And I'm just like, all right, I kind of want to chase some barbell lifts, like have some fun with strength, do things in the weight room that I would have told you previously were not that optimal. And that's fine because, you know what, I'm still going to make more progress than if I quit the gym, which I don't think will ever happen. But this is like a nice in your intermediate phase, or I'm having fun with it. It's something different. And I think that's such an important part. Again, that Eric Helms pyramid of adherence being the most important thing. You need to do something that is enjoyable, that you can commit to as far as time spent in the gym, that you can continue to kind of get excited about hitting PRs. And I think, again, with a high volume approach, you will probably get fatigued and find it really hard to continue to hit PRs, which is possibly a sign that like your training is not great in general. And I think that's really about it. I'm sure Kathleen and I will have a debate on this in the future, but I hope you all got something out of this. Till next time, guys, be good.